On the Jordan Harbinger Show, you'll hear amazing stories from people that have lived them, from spies to CEOs, even an undercover agent who infiltrated the Gambino crime family. You're about to hear a preview of the Jordan Harbinger Show with Jack Garcia, who did just that.
My career was 24 out of 26 years was solely dedicated working undercover. Now I walk in, I'm in the bar. Now there's a barmaid there, good-looking young lady. She's serving me a drink. Hey, what would you like? Usually my drink was give me a Kettle One martini, 3 olives, glass of water on the side. I finish the drink. The guys come in. I'm going to go in my pocket, take out the big wad of money. Bam, I give her $100. If you're with the mob, I say, hey, Jordan, you're on record with us. That means we protect you. Nobody could shake you down. We could shake you down, but you're on record with us.
For more on how Jack became so trusted in the highest levels of the Gambino organization, check out episode 392 of The Jordan Harbinger Show.
This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast, part of the Sinica Network from SUP China. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I am your host, Jared Turner, longtime resident of China, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, and What If There Were No Hypothetical Questions? My co-host is John Pazin, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, Sinosplice.com, and told me that right now, anger management courses are all the rage. Do you ever feel like you're trying to get conversational in Chinese, but seem to be stuck in textbooks and classes? In this episode, John and I are going to discuss the leap involved in moving beyond textbook Chinese to conversational Chinese. Interview is with Andrew Methven, whose adventures of backpacking through the mountains and villages of China inspired him to learn the language. All this and more, let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming at you from Utah in the United States.
Hi everybody, my name is John Pazden and I am in Shanghai, China.
All right, John, let's kick this one off. We're going to be talking a little bit about not just studying for tests, but also preparing yourself for real conversation and ways to actually use your Chinese.
Yeah, I've actually talked to a lot of people who have this problem, typically Americans. You know, they went to school in the U.S., they took Chinese schools maybe, but they want to actually use their Chinese, and they realize that all they've ever done is study from textbooks. Maybe they prepped for the HSK, but they realize that their spoken Mandarin isn't that good, even though they've been studying for a while, and they're just like, what do I do? Like, how do I get my Chinese to a more decent spoken level? And so that's what we're talking about, switching from like this, traditional classroom, textbook-focused approach to somehow, getting into this groove where you can actually communicate face-to-face.
So if you've been there or you are there, raise your hand. And I think that's a lot of raised hands out there, John. So it's a pretty common issue, right? It's a common thing of like, oh, well, maybe I'm doing well on my tests. I've been studying Chinese for years now, but maybe you're not conversational. You're kind of like, what do I do? How do I really be able to get to the point where I can do something with my Chinese?
Yeah, and it's been a few years for me personally, but I was actually in this boat back in the day because I studied 3 semesters at the University of Florida. I used the integrated Chinese textbook by Chung and Tsui, 2nd edition. I brought my textbooks with me to China, and I was like, I've got these textbooks. Now what do I do? So, I've been there. This is not an episode for those people that, just showed up in China and they're trying to learn Chinese, without any resources. No, this is for you guys who have been in the classroom in a non-Chinese speaking environment.
Well, I think let's first dissect a little bit the classroom. Okay, what this environment is created to do and what we really learn there.
Yeah, so if we wanted to be really cynical, we could say the classroom is designed by, the post-industrial society where, we're trying to manufacture workers for the, the industrialist nation, and, it's all about maximizing the output and all that. So, doesn't sound that good for individual fluency development, does it?
Exploiting the working class. No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Because let's just think about it real quick. And this is obviously not every classroom is the same, but the traditional concept of the classroom is you have a teacher is in the front of the class, and they may be lecturing or giving a presentation or something. They're educating. They're trying to transfer their knowledge to you. And this is still how most language classrooms work today.
Right. So key phrase there, knowledge transfer, right? Knowledge.
That's right. But language is much more than just knowledge of the language. And as I've brought up this analogy before, as if reading a book on guitar would now make you magically be able to play the guitar, right? Language is much more than just the knowledge. It's building the proficiency and the ability to actually use it, just like a guitar.
Okay, and then key to this also is a little bit of simple math. You know, my other company, Allset Learning, we do one-on-one personalized training in Chinese. And it's all about one-on-one because that's how you maximize your speaking practice. If you're in a classroom with 20 people, 10 people, even one other person, that's reducing the amount that you can talk, you can practice speaking in that classroom setting by quite a bit, like for every additional person, assuming that everyone has roughly equal speaking time. So that aspect of the classroom is super important to keep in mind. It really limits your talking time.
It's a real big deal. And this is something that's really obvious, but just remembering that language development, we're not just talking, there's kind of four general areas. Well, there's two basic divisions, input and output, and then you could do oral and written. But in all those you have, listening, speaking, reading, writing. So those are kind of the four general areas. And in that traditional classroom environment, you're mainly just getting listening. And you may get some reading practice, but even as we've talked about a lot, even the reading is going to be very minimal. To really build proficiency in reading, you don't need to read just 100 or 1,000 characters. You need to be reading tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of characters over a period of time. So the classroom environment, it's very good at, well, maybe it's very good, but it's more effective in transferring some knowledge and helping you get, introducing the language to you. But it is not very effective in giving you a lot of practice in building your proficiency, specifically in the speaking and even reading and writing.
Okay, now we should also specifically mention one of the key resources for traditional, classroom-based learning, and that's the textbook. And it's not that the textbook itself is bad. Actually, there are a lot of good textbooks, especially in recent years. Some pretty good textbooks have come out. They focus on interesting and useful topics. The vocabulary is high-frequency vocabulary. The grammar points are ones you want to learn early. This is stuff where if you learn it, then you can really do well with your Chinese. The problem is that the classroom environment maybe is more focused on testing and, moving you through the curriculum rather than practice. But it's not exactly the textbook that's the problem. You do have a good resource there.
Absolutely. In fact, there's an academic named Rob Waring. I really like a lot of his work. He's a big, extensive reading guy. But, a lot of times in some of these communities, and sometimes, I guess, let's even say for us, John, the textbook is kind of the whipping boy. It's like, the textbook. No, it's actually the textbooks and a lot of these curriculums are very good at introducing the language. And that's what they're there for. And if you really pay attention, if you go through a textbook, you may, as you progress chapter by chapter, pay attention to what is actually reused from the previous chapters. And you'll find that frequently there is not a lot of repetition. And as you can see, they're introducing the new language to you, but they're not providing that constant reinforcement that you really need to build the proficiency in the language. So it's just one of these things of recognizing what is a textbook really for, and also what is it not good at. And so it's kind of one of the things like just studying the textbook. Are you going to get fluent? No, because you need to do a lot more things to really build a fluency. There we go, John. I said the F word, fluency. But proficiency in a language in order to, get to a point where, hey, I can really do something with my language.
Yeah, so on the subject of textbooks, there are some bad ones. And what you say about, not repeating and reinforcing what you've learned before in earlier chapters, I think often that is a conscious decision. And the reason that's done is by minimizing overlap, you're maximizing the amount of content, the amount of vocabulary words, the amount of, characters of text you can cover throughout the textbook, and that you can then cover in this semester for this curriculum at this school. So, that's like the really unfortunate, like worst case scenario. But then there are also textbooks which are not designed to just, get the numbers right.
And John, this is actually somewhat of a vicious cycle that I've seen at times. I'm talking to teachers and administrators, is that the teacher, they're going through the book and they know they're kind of cruising through material, right? And they're introducing all this new stuff, but they know maybe the students aren't quite getting it. And you, as a student, know you're not really getting it. You do well on maybe the quiz and the test, but your Chinese isn't necessarily getting better. But but at the same time, administrators, when they're looking for curriculum, oftentimes they're looking for stuff that will introduce all this knowledge. But so publishers are often trying to put a lot of, as John you mentioned, a lot of maximizing the curriculum, if you will, maximizing the amount of new content that can be in there, because the idea is, if it's taught, therefore it's learned. Now, there are a lot of great teachers and administrators out there that totally get this, but there is still that prevailing model out there that still kind of fuels some of these, I would say, this vicious cycle at times. And so I guess the question is, John, how do we break out of this, right? How do we get out of this thing of just, I'm just studying the textbook, I'm following the curriculum, I'm preparing for the test, which I intend to pass, versus saying, how can I get to the point where I can really actually use and do something with my Chinese?
All right, so I think we've established that the classroom environment is not conducive to lots of speaking practice, and the larger school environment is often not focused on giving you enough practice and repetition that you need. But as we said already, sometimes the textbook is okay. The textbook is not the problem. So I think it's useful to take a framework to look at this whole situation and see maybe what's missing and what we can focus on to take this textbook resource and then make it more useful towards building conversational fluency. And fortunately, we have talked about this type of framework in the past.
Absolutely. We're going to take a page from one of our favorite academics by the name of Paul Nation.
Yeah, so Jared, way back in episode 19 of this podcast, we talked about Paul Nation and the 4 strands of fluency development. And he specifically addressed how this can be done in the classroom. And sadly, it is often not done in the classroom, but these 4 strands are super useful as a framework for what you need to be doing in a Chinese course to build fluency.
That's right. So these 4 strands, we're going to walk through them real quick to give you kind of that framework. But they're also a bit kind of academic terms, I would say. So we're going to kind of interpret, make it a little easier to understand as well. So the first one he talks about is comprehensible, meaning-focused input. So I would just simplify this to saying, hey, comprehensible input that has some sort of meaning to you. So we're talking about reading, listening. And this isn't just like reading something random. It's something that is, or just listening to just some random tape or song or movie or whatever. This is actually trying to get some sort of input that is interesting to you. It's relevant to you, to what you're doing, or like I said, wherever your interests lie. So you need to have that opportunity to have that engagement, to that listening, reading, to something that you want to engage with.
And if you have a good textbook, that can be a good chunk of that meaning-focused input. But you're also going to want more that relates to you personally, that you actually want to talk about when you engage with other people on an individual level.
An important point to note about this is that you're typically not going to get that in the classroom, right, John?
That is true, Jared. But what you will get in the classroom, this is number 2 of the 4 strands, is form-focused instruction. So when I see form-focused, I think of like drills, fill in the blank with grammar, structures, that kind of thing. But this is what the classroom does a lot of.
That's right. So this will be like lessons, instructions. It could be a lecture, presentations. Just a lot of the stuff of going through the textbook and following the curriculum is largely this form-focused instruction. It's lessons. It's teaching, and it's an important part of language development. But as you see, as we're going to get through the rest of these, you realize it's not the only aspect to really build fluency.
Okay, so number 3 is meaning-focused output. And it could be writing, but we're probably mostly talking about speaking here. So when we say meaning-focused output, you're actually trying to express something that you care about. You're not just making random sentences. You're not plugging vocabulary words into a grammar pattern just to make a sentence, right? You actually want to communicate.
So this is stepping outside of the textbook again, or a little bit stepping outside of whatever that curriculum is, because now it's not just what's assigned for you to produce, in the form of speaking or writing, but it's something that you are actually, want to convey. Now, it can be task-based. It can be classroom. And in fact, there's a lot of classroom activities that are designed to help you produce this. But the main thing about it is that you're deliberately trying to create some sort of comprehensible output to another person.
Right, and you need a lot of it. That is the third strand.
The last one is number 4, fluency development. Now, this is really important, and this is something that we really don't get that practice with inside the classroom. This is just simply speaking, right? Or just writing, could be chatting online or whatever. But this is just using your language, just doing something with it. And this is typically the one aspect. The previous 3 that we were talking about, you do get different balances of those in the classroom and different aspects of it, which I still argue is not enough, except for that form-focused instruction. But this fluency development aspect is something you typically just don't get in the classroom at all.
Right, and remember, it's not just speaking, it's also interaction, right? You need to be able to respond. You need to be able to anticipate. There are other skills involved. But anyway, that's all going to come from lots of face-to-face interaction, and a good teacher can help design these interactions to be extensible to the rest of the world when you actually go out and use your Chinese.
So you might be asking yourself, all right, well, hey, Jared, John, this is all fine and well, but, I'm doing some of all of these. Well, it's recommended by the experts in the field here that we don't just get, a little bit of each one of these per se, but that actually give each of these equal weight. So he's suggesting that we have 25% of our time doing the comprehensible input, a meaning-focused input, 25% on this instruction, 25% on meaning-focused output, and 25% on fluency development. So that's kind of an equal balance for good language development.
But in a typical classroom, those latter 2 get neglected quite a bit. Like meaning-focused output, it might just be, the teacher calls on you, you say a sentence using, a grammar point. But you should be getting, 25% of your lesson time on this. And then fluency development, a lot of that is going to involve words that you've learned a long time ago. You're not learning new words in grammar. You're practicing using it in different ways, and you're getting more adept, more fluent in the stuff that you've already, quote unquote, learned.
So as you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, wait a second, now I kind of realize maybe why I'm plateauing, or maybe I'm not feeling like I'm making the progress that I want to, it's because maybe you're putting most of your eggs in one of these baskets. And instead, we need to kind of distribute those out a little bit wider to give you the real development that you need to progress your Chinese language skills.
Okay, so let's address the problem more specifically. So if this is you know that you haven't been getting a lot of fluency development or a lot of speaking practice in the classroom. Your textbook is all right, but you want to actually become fluent in Chinese, then what do you do? Okay, so all of this has been kind of setting the stage to answer this question. And I'd like to start off by giving an example that I see a lot, which I think is quite representative of this issue. And that is the simple task of self-introductions. So when you first start studying Chinese, you learn how to say, my name is, I am from. Maybe you introduce your family. But the crazy thing is that in a typical course, you don't spend much more time on that, even though your vocabulary and your grammar and your fluency are getting better and better. You could be studying Chinese for 2 years, and you're still introducing yourself the same way you did when you first started in the first couple weeks. So that's a good example. It's like, ripe for fluency development, for meaning-focused output. When you're meeting Chinese people, you need to be able to talk about yourself, and that's the start of a relationship. Not only that, but not every self-introduction starts with them going, "Please introduce yourself," and then you're given the stage, right? The self-introduction has all kinds of ways in, like maybe it's this question, maybe it's that question. So again, that's fluency development, being able to tackle the same problem in different ways.
That's so true. And if your textbook suggests you start your conversation by saying "ni hao ma," then, oh man, nobody says that. Nobody says that, John.
That is true. That is true. So what do? What you want to do is you want to take all this stuff that you've learned before in your textbook. You kind of know these words, and you have to practice using them. Some people do this by, hiring a tutor and kind of working through it. But the key is to find ways to use the vocabulary and the grammar that you know is useful to have conversations that you actually want to have, or that you know that you will need to have when you're speaking with Chinese people.
Absolutely. And, this may be a little self-serving, John, but I'll even throw this out there of why we always recommend, like extensive reading and graded readers. Because if you have a graded reader, you're going to get that comprehensible input, going to get a lot of reading. That gives you opportunities to talk about your book, or explain it maybe to your tutor, teacher, classmate, friend, whatever, and giving you some meaning-focused output. You're actually specifically trying to convey an idea. In doing this, you really reinforce two of those four aspects to really kind of build your proficiency in the language. The one that you still need to continue to focus on is that fluency development, and that's just, hey, getting out there and using your language for whatever the heck you want to do.
Another thing that I've noticed that people need a lot of, and this is usually not addressed by classrooms, is to be coached out of this like passive role in a conversation. So the typical like student that communicates in a way that mirrors the dialogues that they studied from their textbook, they kind of wait to be asked things, and then when they hear a question they recognize, they know how to respond to it. But actually, what you really want to do to improve your fluency and to improve your conversations in Chinese is to also practice being proactive. Like, why do you have to wait to be asked the question? Why can't you ask the other person about themselves? Ask them to introduce themselves. Ask them questions about, things that you like, and see what they think about that. So that's not something that's going to happen overnight. It might not be something that you're fully equipped to do right away because you're just not used to doing it. You might not have all the correct vocabulary or question forms or whatever. But do practice being proactive in starting conversations and follow-up questions and getting the other person talking.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So you're taking interest in people, thinking of new things to ask about. And, hey, maybe there is someone you see again and again, and maybe this is actually a great example, John, because you can actually, something that you're curious, you want to know about this person or a question you have to ask. Well, you can go through and do some studying about it. You can understand maybe some of the words you need to ask. You can maybe understand some of the words you need to know in order to ask the questions that you want to ask. And then you could even practice that a little bit. And then you can get out there and actually practice using that in a real conversation.
Exactly. And then another thing is you got to kind of know yourself. So some people, they like to talk. They like to tell stories about themselves. And it's totally easy to practice telling stories about your life in Chinese. You just got to, look up the words, practice it, get feedback from your teacher, work on it. That's fairly straightforward, and it's not something you're going to find in a textbook. Whereas other people, maybe they're kind of more like an interviewer, and they want to be able to ask cool, interesting, probing questions about Chinese society or whatever. So they want to focus more on coming up with good questions and good follow-up questions, and then being able to understand what the responses are. That's a personal thing that you just gotta kind of think about on your own.
And I will say this, John, I'm a very extroverted guy.
You are.
I call you a high-functioning introvert, right? But, not everyone is out there really saying, they just don't even speak a lot in your native language. There's some other things you could do even for fluency development. I mean, like I said, is online chatting. But there are some other tools out there, like one of our previous guests, Robin McPherson. He has a website called Journally, and you can just you keep a journal in the language you're learning. So hey, there you go. That's gonna be an opportunity where it's maybe it's not academic. It's not really like instruction or really like something where you're focused on like I'm really trying to learn. Maybe it's just some opportunity to use your language every day. It's just maybe doing some writing. So, I mean, there's so much things that you can do to just use your language. It's just you got to figure out what is going to be best for you, what works for you, and more importantly, what do you want to accomplish? What are your goals? And work towards those goals as part of your language learning experience.
And writing something out is actually a really good way to practice like getting better at speaking it. It seems a little like an oxymoron, but you start out by writing everything down. You figure out all the vocabulary you need, all the things that you want to say that you don't know how to say. And then once you get all that out, then you can practice it with a teacher. And maybe you don't even go back to the written form, but it definitely gets the ball rolling. And after you practice it a few times, you can make it your own. So yeah, I'm definitely a big fan of writing, and that does help your speaking too. So I think we've hit most of the major points here. It is possible to take your textbook classroom-based learning experience and convert it to something that works in conversations, but it does take effort. And I think if you open up your textbook to chapter 3 and you're like, how the heck am I going to make this topic related to myself and something I want to talk about? Yeah, it is kind of hard, but it's also possible. And if your textbook is good, none of the topics are going to be just like a super waste of time. You might want to skip that chapter on the post office, but for the most part, you can find ways to make it your own. It does take effort, but you can learn Chinese even with a textbook.
Oh, you sure can. And so get out there and do it, guys, but it's going to take more than the textbook, as you now know. All right, now it's time for a word from our sponsor. Today, our sponsor is
HSK Mod Courses by All Set Learning. So, Jared, I have to confess, this seemed a little self-serving, but I didn't actually think about this right away when we first started talking about the whole textbook problem. However, All Set Learning has come up with something that's kind of relevant to today's topic.
That's right. Well, hey, this is the sponsor section, so it is self-serving. But hey, these are really applicable courses to anyone who found this episode very helpful.
All right, so the idea is you have the HSK, it's the standardized test for Mandarin Chinese put out by the Chinese government. And there's this standard textbook series, which is, it's fine. Use this textbook series to take the test and all that. But what if you want to improve your speaking? What if you want to study for the HSK, but you also want to speak more? You want to work on your pronunciation. You want to have actual conversations with a teacher. Well, that's what this HSK Mod course is all about.
Oh, really? Tell me more, John.
So every topic has extra speaking practice. It's not from the textbook. It's extra discussion. It's all one-on-one online with a live human teacher. Your pronunciation gets extra practice because we always focus on proper pronunciation. And you'll just get way more speaking practice than you can ever do just going through a typical HSK course. In fact, a lot of people that do these HSK Mod courses, they do it after they've already finished the textbook. And then by going back through it this way, they get that extra speaking practice, that fluency development that they never had while they were studying in a more traditional course.
Wow, that sounds great. So where can we find these, John?
All right, so allsetlearning.com/HSK-mod. You can see lots more info about what's in the courses and check it out.
We'll put a link in the show notes. All right, now it's time for rants and raves. John, what do you have for us today? Do you have a rant or do you have a rave?
I have a slight rant. It's one of those rants that it's really only a rant if you're being like a little culturally intolerant, but whatever.
All right.
I'm entitled to just a tiny bit of that, right? So it's just My friend Pete and I, who has been a guest on the show, we do this advanced readings in Chinese newsletter together, and we have a joke in every episode. And we were just talking about how Chinese like puns, when they use like the wrong character in a pun, they always put it in quotes. And as a non-Chinese person, it kind of feels like they think you're not smart enough to get the pun if they don't put it in quotes. It's like, hey, there's a pun here. Look, we put it in quotes for you. It just feels so patronizing. But, to the Chinese, it's just normal. They don't feel patronized. But I don't know. It's just one of those things that as a non-native speaker, it always just kind of feels a little off.
Yeah, I think we talked about this before, right? It's like a bit in the different perceptions of humor in Chinese is that the humor in Chinese is a little bit more explained, right? It's kind of like, almost like explaining the joke a little bit in the joke, right? And
when it comes to puns, it's in the form of quotation marks. I've actually written on this in Sinosplice a lot, but anyway, it just came up today, so I wanted to rant slightly. But enough of my babbling. Jared, do you have a rant or rave for us?
I've got a rave. And this came up recently, and I think we may have mentioned this before, but finding Chinese TV shows and movies, specifically on Netflix. Now, here's one of the challenges is that if you go to Netflix and you pull up a movie, maybe go pick up your latest whatever hit movie it is, you'll find that there's a lot of languages that there are subtitles and dubs for, but typically not so in Chinese. But here's what I found out with Netflix is that you can go in and you can find a bunch of TV shows, but it's not always easy to do just finding that specific genre in Chinese. So here's what you got to do. You got to log into Netflix on your computer, open up the web browser, and then you search just Chinese. And when you search Chinese, they will bring up obviously a lot of shows that maybe are Chinese shows, and there might be some other things that are related to it. But if you look up at the top, there are categories that'll be, say, Chinese TV dramas, romantic Chinese TV dramas, Chinese movies, romantic Chinese, it gives you all these categories that you can now select from, and you can specifically look at specific genres of Chinese movies and TV shows that you're interested in watching. And so I'm like, whoa, this is really good. There are some other codes as well. If you search on Google you'll find that, hey, there's specific like codes for this type of genre of stuff. But this is one of the easiest ways that I had found. So you don't have to like kind of delve through these long lists of things so you find exactly what you're looking for. But yeah, and there are a lot of things on Netflix. I haven't looked into some of the other platforms specifically about this, but I'm sure you can do it. But Netflix is definitely a great resource to find a whole bunch of Chinese TV shows and movies.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are using Netflix. So wait, you search Chinese and then you go to the category filter, is that right?
Yeah, that's a strange thing. Just making it clear about this on Netflix is that there's not really like a browse genre link, at least that I've been able to find. It's that you have to search for something, and this is only on the web browser, okay? So if you do it on your app, or I think even like if you have it, you're logged in on like a smart TV, this won't come up in this way. But if you go on your web browser, search Chinese, then it has some links at the top. It'll say explore titles related to, and then it'll give you a whole bunch of categories. So that's a great way to find some ones you're interested in. Then you can add it to a list or whatever. And once you start watching these, then the algorithm will pick this up, and it might start actually now suggesting some of these other shows that you might like if you're getting into them.
All right, got it. Thanks, Jared.
And on that note, John, is there a good TV show recently that you've been watching?
I'm a little embarrassed, but I've gotten hooked on one of these Chinese dramas. It's called 假日暖洋洋2. But
yeah, that one. It's hilarious. I love that. Actually, I don't know which one that is.
All right. Well, if you saw the ad, you'd realize why I'm embarrassed. But anyway, there's good stuff out there.
That sounds great. All right, we'll go out there and start watching some movies in Chinese.
I've been learning Chinese for around 20 years now, UK-based, but when I can, I go to China quite a lot, several times a year.
That's Andrew Methven joining me from London.
And over the last nearly 18 months through lockdown, I've been writing and publishing a newsletter called Slow Chinese, Major Man Went, that helps more advanced learners of Chinese understand how to use modern or colloquial Chinese language that people are using today.
Andrew's story illustrates how one can take their passion and weave it into the fabric of their life and career. And Andrew has definitely done that. Stay with us. All right, Andrew, why did you start learning Chinese?
The motivation has changed quite a lot as I've carried on, but to begin with, it was really simple. I went to China and couldn't speak a word of the language, and the purpose of me going there was to travel.
Oh.
And so it was a fairly straightforward and yet existential need to be able to buy things, eat, find places to stay in the kind of places I was going to in China, which were mostly quite remote. And almost certainly no one where I was would speak English, so I had to learn basics quite quickly in order to get around and make my way through the country.
Well, Andrew, a lot of people will go to China for travel. I mean, were you going there for holiday, for vacation? I mean, what kind of travel were we talking about here?
So I traveled to China overland from the UK.
Oh.
And the plan was to take the train through Europe, Russia, Mongolia, and into China. The original plan was to take 2 or 3 months to go through the country and then carry on through Southeast Asia and to Australia. So there was no plan in terms of why I went other than to go and explore. And the original idea was 2-3 months. In the end, it was about a year, that first trip.
Were you a year in China, or the whole trip was about a year?
The in China part was just under a year.
Wow.
And then totally I was away for like 2 years.
Wow. Okay. Now this sheds a little more light on it because, like I said, a lot of people will go to China for holiday, to travel, but few of those people will say, hey, I'm going to really learn Chinese before I go. So what stage did you decide, okay, I'm going to learn Chinese? And heck, why did you even decide to do this type of trip?
It was just for an adventure. So I graduated from university with no real idea of what I wanted to do or where I wanted to go. So I decided to travel.
Sounds like kind of like a gap year, but after college instead of before, right?
Yeah, it was kind of a gap year. And I set no time limit. There was no idea that I could go away for a year and then come back. It was just I was going to go and then see what happened. So that was the original thinking. Why did I go to China? Because I didn't want to go somewhere that someone else had been before me that I knew. Obviously, I knew lots of people would have been before me, but I just wanted to go to somewhere that was completely different from what I know, but also different in terms of the place that most people would normally go to. It just looked huge on the map. My only experience was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon before I got to China, and I'd read a couple of travel books.
Excellent movie.
I think quite a lot of the inspiration behind why I thought it would be a cool idea to go was actually because I'd seen that movie and I thought it was amazing.
You're not the first person we've had on this podcast who's been inspired by that movie. So,
really?
Hey, you're in good company, yes.
But the thing is, when you go there, certainly when I got there, on a cold, grey winter morning in Beijing, having taken a 2-day train from Mongolia, it doesn't look like that at all. And so it was a huge shock to go from the images of that movie to the actual experience of going to China at that time. I think a big part of where I was going was I wanted to go to China to experience it. So the part of the journey before then, I quickly went through Europe, spent a few weeks going through Russia and Siberia, and then Mongolia was like a month. It felt like I was on the way to China. And so that was a big part of what I wanted to do. And then I got to China and it felt really harsh. Like the weather, it was really cold, really dry. Yeah, it did actually in Beijing, because I think partly it's just the time of year, it's just so grey and cold. But also, I just never experienced anything quite like it. It was just so big. And it was kind of overwhelming, actually, when I first got there. But then at the same time, there was something about, I think more the people, actually, that you start to connect with people. And I think the biggest shock for me was that this place looks nothing like I expected it to look. But then as you travel, you gradually see actually the essence of China is actually within the people and the language. Even if you're learning really small parts of the language, you get more of an idea of the country. And so that's what really interested me. That's why I didn't really decide. I just became interested and just started on a journey, both physically, I was traveling around China, but then also part of it was picking up language and learning more about the country as I went.
Well, at what point did you start learning Chinese? Was it before you got to China, or you got there and said, all right, maybe I better start learning?
Yeah, so it was the second one. I didn't learn any Chinese before I'd got to China. And then I started trying to learn pretty quick, actually. I didn't learn quickly, but I started very quickly to realize that having a little bit of language was helpful. I think after a few weeks, I started using this small red dictionary, and I had a notebook, and I would write things down in pinyin whenever I picked up new words. And so that's how I started. And through that whole year, that's pretty much how I learned. So I would, in a conversation on a train, be trying to chat with someone, and I'd pick up a word or two and write it down in the book. And gradually, because the conversations that you can have at the very basic level are quite repetitive.
It's like, what country are you from? How old are you? What is your job? Are you married?
Yeah, very, very easy. You know, there's a checklist of maybe 10 questions that you're ready for wherever you go.
That's really cool. I mean, a lot of people would have just said, all right, hey, maybe this is hard, right? Or maybe I'm not cut out for this or whatever. And you might go back to your home country, in a few months, but you stayed for a year. Why?
I think that just the travel and the experiences that I ended up having were just so breathtaking. So I traveled across the whole west, mostly across the western half of China. So Gansu province was amazing, Qinghai province, Sichuan, and then of course Tibet and Xinjiang as well. The scenery that you see and the remoteness is just, I'd never experienced anything like that before. And so it was this feeling of going to explore completely new and alien places, which I just kept doing it. But I think the thing that's stuck with me the most is I hitchhiked from a place in Gansu called Xiahe. I think it's the biggest yellow hat Buddhist monastery outside of the Tibetan plateau or outside of Tibet. At the time, it was kind of on the beaten path if you were crazy enough to go to Gansu province as a backpacker at the time. Yeah, that was my first actual experience of being deep in China. And I met this Dutch guy, and we just really hit it off.
A Dutch guy?
Yeah, it kind of...
Where at?
So just in this particular place, in this monastery village, it was a backpacker destination of sorts. So, there's one hotel or one kind of guest house in that place. And then, there's like 5 backpacker type people. So we met and hit it off, and then we decided to hitchhike to, south. Eventually we got to Hainan province several months later.
That is an island, mind you. You can't hitchhike to Hainan, right?
There was a boat in there somewhere.
You stowawayed, right?
Stowed away. When we left Xiahe, we weren't thinking, how do we stow away to the island of Hainan? We just walked south and...
Really?
Yeah, walked and hitchhiked through Gansu province. Occasionally we would take buses if that was available. But there was this one trip we did, which we walked from north to south in Sichuan province along a river that I think pretty much is the line between Sichuan and Tibet on the map. And it just felt like we were walking for months, and every 20 or 30 kilometers or so there will be a village. And in that village there will be a shop and a very small kind of noodle restaurant or something for the locals to eat. And day after day, week after week, we would walk to the next village, talk to the local shopkeeper, find something to eat, stay in someone's house, wake up the next day and carry on to the next place. And we just did that for weeks.
Wow.
And the scenery in that part of China is absolutely stunning. The mountains, and there's these crazy buildings. They're like almost like castles, but a cross between an English cottage, like a Swiss kind of chalet, and a dark kind of castle. They're really amazing buildings, very sparsely populated, obviously, but I just remember this particular hitchhiking trip. We would just see this most amazing scenery and meet people along the way. So probably my most memorable hitching experience was when we hitched with a truck full of Buddhist monks. We were in the back of a lorry. And of course, in that part of China at that time, none of the roads were proper roads. They were mud tracks in the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
We hitched for a day or even 2 days, I can't remember, with a lorry full of, I don't know how many there were, like 20 or 30 Buddhist monks, all in their robes. And the only way we could try and speak was through very basic Mandarin. And my advantage was I knew literally a handful of words, but to someone that didn't speak any Chinese, like the friend I was traveling with, I was quite useful.
Wow.
Because I could at least communicate in basic terms.
Something I find real interesting here is like, hey, you stayed in people's homes.
Yeah.
Okay, I got to say, I'm a little bit more used to the big city life in China, right? But I know it's a different ball game when you're in these small little villages and towns and people's like perception. I imagine you're the first foreigners that these people had ever seen, and you just come hiking along the river into their town. So tell me about that. How did you actually find those accommodations and find a place to stay?
It generally felt like we were maybe the first foreigners or non-Chinese people that people in these villages had met, or it certainly seemed like that. There was never a problem finding somewhere to stay, because if you walk into one of these villages or you get off a truck driving to one of these villages, normally there's only one vehicle or truck that would stop per day going through somewhere like that. And so you would arrive and that would be one of the highlights of the day. There's new people turning up. It just so happened that we were even more new than normal because we were foreigners. And then you just meet people. Generally, people will come out and meet you because it's such an interesting or unusual situation where you have a foreigner turning up. So we would just start conversations, and I don't know how we managed it. Wherever we went, we would always find somewhere to stay. And there was never a guest house. So it would be, we slept in a school one time. Often people would welcome us into their houses, very kind of small houses, or sometimes there was a guest house. We would always feel really welcome wherever we went.
Wow, that sounds like a really neat experience. Special memories.
Yeah, and I think that's why I became so interested, because it felt like the more I was learning, the more I could understand. And the more rewarding that was, to be able to go somewhere and use the language to find somewhere to stay and then gradually get to know the people that we were meeting.
So you went back to England, but I can tell, Andrew, from that point till right now, your Chinese has improved. So you're going back to the UK, though. There's not all the Chinese people there like it was on your trip there through China. But why did you continue to study? And what was kind of more that impetus to continue with your studies? And what were you doing to improve?
So after the first year in China, end goal was to go to Australia. So that's where I eventually got to. But then in Australia, I just found myself always seeking out the Chinese community wherever I was, so a Chinatown, and I just really missed the feeling of being in Asia and particularly being in China. And so eventually decided to go back, found a job teaching English in a really small village in the middle of Taiwan, and then lived there for around a year. That was about a year. Did come back to the UK, and then again had this feeling that I wanted to go back. So I did, back to Taiwan in Tainan, and again worked teaching English and then studied. The purpose was to go and study Chinese. So yeah, it was a period of several years kind of going back between Asia and Australia, or Asia and the UK.
Well, this is great to hear this, because there's a lot of people out there, Andrew, that are in the shoes that you were in at that point in your life. And they're like, hey, Chinese, I really enjoy this, or I think there's a future here. There's something for me learning this language. But how did you end up charting that course to say, hey, Chinese is part of my career? Chinese is part of what I want to do in life, actually connecting that with career opportunities?
So I think finding a career in the UK based around either Chinese language or experience in China is actually quite difficult, even now. Obviously, you're very employable if you're in China and you've got the language skills and the experience behind you. In my own experience, I was just driven by the interest in the language, and I just kept going. Eventually, I found opportunities through my own interest. I just kept going with it. But I think in terms of career advice for someone that's more at the start of their career, I would say if you're interested in Chinese or China and want that to be part of your career, it's probably easier to start that journey in China.
A little more opportunities there sometimes.
Yeah.
So they're a little maybe easier to find you. And, this is also good to hear from your perspective, Andrew. I mean, you're learning Chinese 15, 20 years ago. Maybe not quite 20, but close, right?
No, the first time I went was in 2002. So yeah, pretty much exactly 20 years to the month, in fact.
So I think it's great that it's almost like the Stone Age, if you will, of Chinese learning, right? Back when we had paper dictionaries, didn't have smartphones, didn't have all these resources that we have now. And so what do you think were some of the biggest challenges, at least in that period of time, learning Chinese, perhaps in comparison to today?
I suppose the fundamental challenges are the same, which are really getting the hang of tones is really hard. And I think it doesn't really matter whether that was now or 20 years ago or even longer ago. So tones are really difficult. I think just the confidence part as well. So I think one thing why I was quite successful in that first year of being in China is that I thought I was better than I was.
That's pretty normal.
And so I was probably a little bit overconfident in my abilities, but because of that, I wasn't inhibited. And so actually, I think I probably benefited from that. So yeah, I think having confidence, getting your head around the volume of stuff you need to know in order to be really good. So whatever level you are of the language, anything new could come up in pretty much any conversation or in anything you're reading. And that can be really challenging, even if now I would say I'm pretty advanced in terms of my abilities in the language, but I still regularly come across completely new things. And sometimes a good example is a joke. So a joke in Chinese, if there's one word that you don't understand and it happens to be the punchline, then the whole joke makes no sense. And so that can be really hard in terms of knocking your confidence. I suppose learning now, there are advantages then. In theory, I would have thought you probably could learn quicker. But then at the same time, I think there's a lot to be said for learning in the manual way. So, for example, learning characters and learning radicals and writing them out, that's part of the process, actually. I think actually the manual approach where you're mixing the action of writing and the processing in your mind and then also speaking it out.
Well, I like something that you said earlier, that you thought your Chinese was better than it really was. And I just have pictured in my mind, Andrew, like younger Andrew hiking through these villages in China. And these are the first time these people in these villages have even seen a foreigner. And here you are speaking some Chinese. They're always going to be like, oh, 你的中文很好, right? You're like, your Chinese is really good.
No matter how bad your Chinese is, the only thing pretty much anyone will say about it is how fantastic your Chinese is. And so it's very easy to fall into this assumption that your Chinese is great, no matter how bad it is.
What I'm curious to know, Andrew, at what point did you realize your Chinese was not as good as you thought it was?
So I still have those experiences regularly now, actually.
Yeah, me too.
Because it does go up and down, especially not being in China. If you're not using it every day, it tends, you'd get rusty. So the reality really hit me when I first started to learn in more of a structured way and trying to learn characters. And that was probably a year and a half or even 2 years after I'd first started learning. And I realized then that I'd missed out not learning characters earlier because that helps consolidate everything. That first time when I settled down in Taiwan to learn with textbooks, more of a structured approach, that was when.
Now, at what point do you feel like your Chinese really took off? Or maybe not even took off, but you feel like you really had some breakthrough moments like, oh, hey, this is really starting to click.
Yeah, I think when you're particularly learning in a really intensive way, I remember going through these periods where it felt like I would suddenly get quite a lot better and then get worse again over a more extended period of time and then plateau for a little bit. And then I would suddenly feel like I'd got a bit better again. If you mapped it out on a graph, it would be going up like that and then peaking and then going down a bit, then going up like a sharp increase again. But there was one time, particularly the second time that I was in Taiwan learning in a language school in Tainan. And I wouldn't say invent, but I found an approach that really worked for me in terms of learning. And that was to pick out sentences, quite long sentences that I'd heard or found somewhere and read them out loud and record myself doing it. And then listen back and then practice these sentences. And then after a few months of doing that, one time, I can't remember, maybe I was in a bar or something, maybe ordering something in a restaurant. And I noticed that as I ordered, my tones changed naturally. So there was 2-3 tones in a row or something like that. Or maybe it was the tonal change of like E or E or E. And I just suddenly noticed, wow, that happened without me trying. All along, I thought, well, this is just impossible to learn these tones and actually do it naturally. And then realizing that actually it's possible for it to become natural.
Well, that's great. And that should give hope to anyone listening who's still struggling with that. We all still struggle with tones, right? But the fact that they can feel natural and that they can come out naturally, it's just with enough practice, enough input, right?
Yeah. And also something else that I find encouraging is when you hear Chinese people get their tones wrong. If you're talking to someone, for example, from Sichuan or Yunnan that have their dialect or actually kind of their Fangyan, their local language, they get tones in Putonghua wrong all the time because a third tone in Yunnan language is different to a third tone in Mandarin. I always find that quite encouraging too when you hear Chinese people get it wrong.
Yeah, you're not alone, right? I've mentioned this before on this podcast, but I had a girl who worked for me and she was from Sichuan and she was from some small village. And she said she didn't start learning Mandarin Chinese, standard Mandarin, Putonghua, until she went to college. That's a very real thing, right? But most people aren't like that in China. But I mean, hey, there's still pockets of that. And you get all those different dialects. Well, not even dialects. That's to say we dialects, but as you know, Andrew, right? There's a lot of distinct languages.
Yeah, and I think that was also the challenge learning while I traveled, is that I never really knew what was standard or kind of proper Mandarin. I would just use my version of it. And often the local dialect or the local language was quite a heavy dialect as well. So it's only when I started to learn properly that I got to start to understand what the standard language was.
Well, tell me a little bit about this thing you started, Slow Chinese Newsletter. What was your inspiration for starting this? And tell us about what is this anyway?
So it's a newsletter that I publish every Saturday morning. And I started it in February 2021. And the main motivation for doing it, I just realized that through lockdown and not being able to travel to China, that my level of Chinese was getting worse and worse. Just my ability to even understand, but certainly speak, was getting worse. And so I just decided to invest time every day into reading the news in Chinese as a way to keep current and every day practice a little bit. I started doing that around New Year 2021. And then in February, I decided to start publishing the new things that I learnt every week when I was reading the news. Because I found that any article I was reading, there was always something that was new to me, like an idiom or a colloquial thing or a slang word or like an internet slang word. So rather than just me learning new stuff every week and dropping it into a Word document, I would just start publishing the new words that I learnt every week. And I started doing that on Substack. The first one I published was 7th of February, I think. And then I've published every Saturday since then. So I'm up to number 69 this week. Every issue of the newsletter, I'll take something that's going on in the news that week and I'll read 3 or 4 articles about it in Chinese, and then I'll collate the new words or interesting words that I find, or things that I think, if I was an advanced learner of Chinese and I didn't have enough time to practice Chinese every week, then I would want to learn these 5 things. If I could learn 5 new things a week, then I'd feel better about where my Chinese was. That's the concept.
That's fantastic. And what I've always been amazed is the amount of slang that develops so quickly on Chinese social media. But I should say that we have that in English too, right? Slang develops, on social media. But my general sense is I think in China, it develops faster, almost a little more dynamic. And I don't know why. But yeah, there's always new things popping up all the time. But what are your thoughts about that?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is I think the volume of new content or new words is much higher in the Chinese language or in modern Chinese than what I would observe in English. I don't do the same in English, so it's very hard for me to tell, but it just feels like the metabolism for the Chinese internet to produce new words or slang words is just a lot higher than we have in English. Furthermore, if you're not able to go to China, at the moment it's very hard to get to China. So if you're not there, it's unlikely that you'll be able to have contact with that new language. It's really hard. I think, first of all, censorship plays a role, particularly on social media and social media commentary on stuff. You might call it social media slang with Chinese characteristics, where there's this interplay between language and censorship. I think that makes a difference. But then also I think it's just the pace of change in China, and life is changing quickly there, and so much happens that there's just more content churning through the system.
Something I've always been amazed with is how resourceful Chinese people are. And you say coming up with new words, and to make that clear for anyone listening, they're not coming up with new characters, right? It's just the new combination of existing characters to create new meanings. And I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, so for example, I learned a good one this week in my newsletter, which is 神助攻. 神助攻, Shen, God or spirit. 助 as in 帮助, and 攻 as in 功劳. 神助攻. So that is a basketball term, the word assist, 助攻, but it became a word that gamers used in chat rooms of the game League of Legends, 英雄联盟. And now it's become like a social media slang word to mean someone that did something amazing to help someone else achieve something they thought was impossible. And so that's now a new word that I only learned literally today, but every week I find these new words that are either very new at the time, or for example, literally a new word on the Chinese internet this week is Yao Nie. So Yao is like devil or kind of ghost. Yao guai, like the Yao.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Nie is nickel. So the word for nickel crisis in Chinese is Yao Nie. That's a totally new word this week. Whereas other ones like the Shen Zhu Gong, the one I just said, that started life in around 2017. Prior to that, it was a sporting thing. Then it went into gaming. Then it's gone into social media. And now it's like a mainstream term that you would read in a news article about the nickel crisis. So yeah, there's a lot of words like that. On Monday, I think to myself, what if I can't find anything interesting to write this week? And then normally by Tuesday, I've got too many words and I'm trying to cut things down.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's just the sheer volume of stuff that goes around the internet. We've got 1.4 billion people in that country. I remember I had a friend who was an executive for a large tech firm there in China, and he was speaking at a symposium that I invited him to, and he's just talking about the magnitude of numbers in comparison to what we're used to here in the West. I mean, it's just, it's multiples, orders of magnitude, so much greater. So I think that's amazing. And I'm really happy to hear about what you're doing, and people can learn more about that stuff. That's great. So Andrew, what advice would you give to someone who's starting to learn Chinese right now?
The first thing is focus on learning radicals of Chinese characters really early on and like practice and learn the top 100 or something, or 50. Focus on learning characters.
I'll amend that real quick. Radicals, the term is also components, but you're right.
Okay.
It's those basic building blocks of the characters.
The basic building blocks. One of the biggest challenges when you first start is that there's no reference points. So it's completely alien. There's nothing you can attach it to in your mind to say, right, okay, that is related to that. So if you learn the components.
Also radicals, but the correct terminology is components, yes.
Well, you're the expert, obviously, so I'll take your word for it. Yeah, so learning them really early on, learning characters is important because then you get points of reference and also it contextualizes the language from the characters and understanding them. Then when you add onto it learning to speak, it just ties everything together more quickly. And second, focus on reading. Maybe this is more suited to intermediate and advanced learners, but I think across any level of Chinese, reading also helps consolidate the language a lot quicker. So for example, my own experience of starting my newsletter, it continues to improve because of the investment of time and energy in reading. And then I think just generally, the final thing is just take it easy. When I was learning really intensively, looking back, all I seemed to do was focus time and energy on learning the language. And therefore I missed opportunities to do other stuff, or I would prioritize learning over other stuff. And the thing is, it's actually quite good to take breaks while you're learning, especially if you're doing so intensively, because the language also sinks. It takes a while to sink in. And actually maybe it's best to come out and just take a break and then go back into it.
That's some really good advice. I think what you mentioned there is, sometimes taking a break. This also happens in weight training and fitness. Sometimes I say, all right, you've hit a plateau. Sometimes it's take a break for a week.
Yeah. Rest
your body and then get back into it. And I've noticed that as well in language. Sometimes take a step back. Sometimes your brain just needs a little bit of a rest.
Yeah, well, in fact, it is. I think the philosophy is similar, actually. But it's just another kind of muscle that if you're exercising it really intensively and learning anything, whether it be a language or something else, you have to take a break and allow it to rest so you can then go back into using it intensively again.
Well, Andrew, if people want to find out more about you and about what you're doing, where can they go?
Yeah, so if you just Google Slow Chinese newsletter or Slow Chinese Substack, it's very straightforward. Just subscribe. There's a free newsletter and there's a paid membership. The free newsletter, you get it every week, Saturday. There's about 20 or so new words each week with context and example sentences. Yeah, and hopefully it's a helpful resource for people like me that are still trying to improve their Chinese.
Well, great. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. So if you want to find out where to find that, you can click on that link. Well, Andrew, we really appreciate you taking the time to share this story with us and, your experience and your insight. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me, Jared.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, fisherman, author, programmer, footballer, shepherd, carpenter, traveler, candidate, and that one gal named Maddie. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook at mandarincompanion.com or tag us on social media, #MandarinCompanion. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is Kaiser Kuo at SupChina and Dominic Edgley. I'd like to thank our guest interview, Andrew Methven. Of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Passon. See you next time.